I would assume that this is the start of a broader relaxation across the board. And of course, it's not just the United States that this affects. There are other countries whose weapon systems Ukraine has already been using with far fewer restrictions than those set by the White House.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And this time we are catching up with Keir Giles. Keir is a Russia analyst at the international affairs think tank Chatham House. He's previously worked at the UK Defence Academy, writing and advising on issues ranging from Russian military, defence and security issues to strategy and doctrine. He's the author of multiple publications explaining the Russian approach to warfare, and his latest book is Russia's War on Everybody and What It Means for You. Keir Giles, really good to see you. And just to qualify to people, we are meeting now to update a conversation we had before the announcement from the US that it would allow qualified use of its weapons to strike inside Russia by Ukraine. We'll hear the later part of that conversation before the announcement later, but just wanted to catch up with you to reflect on that particular announcement. That until now, that had really been something that had limited what Ukrainians were wanting to do, Ukrainian forces. And this particular announcement allows very limited use around the Kharkiv area to strike into Russia in the defense of Kharkiv. What can Ukraine do exactly with this new permission?
Well, of course, the fine details are never made public, and what precisely the parameters are, the limitations on exactly what Ukraine can do, is something that, for very good reasons, nobody will be discussing anywhere that Russia could hear it. But of course, the reaction around the world has been, on the one hand, enormous relief that there's been this slight policy shift from the United States, but also a collective facepalm because of the incrementalism, because the United States is still trying to control the extent to which it's happening, keep a damper on how the conflict develops. And as you said, it's in this very limited area with very strict rules on what exactly can be engaged. Some people are interpreting this as the US once again looking to what has already happened to guide its policy on Ukraine, as opposed to what's likely to happen in the future. They're dealing with a situation that has already passed, because all this came to a head when Ukraine was facing the building Russian offensive against Kharkiv, and that's what this policy would be most effective at dealing with. But of course, that situation has already gone. It doesn't address the future situation that Ukraine will face along other sectors of the front.
So is it too little too late?
Well, sadly, it confirms the theory that you can judge these US policy steps, these relaxations of US restrictions, the supply of weapon systems to Ukraine, by this grim tariff of how many unnecessary Ukrainian deaths it takes to actually move the needle on US policy. Once again, it's been the US facing disaster in Ukraine that has actually brought about this shift. Plus, of course, the growing international isolation of the US White House and the fact that so many European leaders had either reconfirmed or stated for the first time that it was nonsensical to put these restrictions on how Ukraine was defending itself.
The outgoing NATO Secretary General seemed to trail this announcement ahead of the NATO foreign ministers meeting, saying that now was the time to lift some of the restrictions, using the word some. Do you think this could just be the starting point and we could actually see a wider softening of those restrictions?
Well, of course, NATO cannot speak on behalf of individual countries that set their own policy on this. But, of course, it was part of the pressure that was growing on the US. When even the NATO Secretary General points out that something needs to change, then that does add a certain amount of moral pressure to all of the logical and the legal reasons why the US should not be setting these restrictions. As for whether it will actually be the first of several relaxations, the pattern of US behavior has been clear. The dogged resistance to doing what people are calling for in support of Ukraine, and then a gradual relaxation, and then later on things getting easier and as though there had been no limitation in the first place. We've seen this over and over again with the supplies of weapon systems and capabilities to Ukraine, the ones that Ukraine have identified as being essential at any particular phase in the conflict, reluctantly and begrudgingly being supplied by the US about a year later in small quantities, and then eventually treated as normal. So yes, I would assume that this is the start of a broader relaxation across the board. And of course, it's not just the United States that this affects. There are other countries whose weapon systems Ukraine has already been using with far fewer restrictions than those set by the White House.
Let's move on to other announcements. And the Pentagon said recently it believes Russia has launched an anti-satellite weapon into the same orbit as a US government satellite. Whether true or not, Russia would want to do this, wouldn't they?
Absolutely right, because this is one of the key areas where Russia feels it is disadvantaged by Western superiority and military capability. And we've seen on the battlefield in Ukraine the effect of Russia seeking to counter some of the high technology weapon systems that the Western countries deploy. We've seen their electronic warfare systems reduce the effectiveness of GPS guided munitions supplied by the United States, for example. It's a technological cat and mouse game there, but in space, and in other areas where Russia can target Western communications, it's been a much longer program. There have been attempts by Russia to investigate the vulnerabilities of telecommunications infrastructure, reconnaissance satellites, and so on in space, in the subsea domain, on land, and in virtual space, dating back not just years but decades. So this is just the latest twist in Russia looking for ways in which it can counter that technological advantage that Western countries, particularly the United States, have.
Can you just begin by giving us an overview of how you see the war in Ukraine at this moment, both on the battle lines and in the wider political arena? Are we approaching a turning point?
Well, it's strange the way the media coverage of the war lags behind the actual real situation on the front line, sometimes by a couple of weeks. So when you're looking at the picture as it's being reported in mainstream media, it tends not to be an accurate reflection of actually what's really happening at the moment in Ukraine. But there's no doubt that all of the slightly dire headlines that we've been seeing over the last few weeks about how Ukraine's time might potentially be running out do actually indicate there's a severe problem for Ukraine, because it is dealing with the aftermath of that interruption of US aid, that period of 6 or 7 months when the supplies on which Ukraine depended were cut off with a US Republican Party foot on the hose. And of course, that has given Russia the ability to take advantage of Ukraine's temporary weakness, particularly in terms of artillery ratios, for example. Also, of course, you have the fact that now this new push from Russia in the Kharkiv direction in the north has taken advantage again of another opportunity that's been offered to Russia by the United States. In this case, the prohibition on Ukraine striking into Russia itself, which has allowed Russia to build up for its offensive more or less unopposed, and also prevented Ukraine from building defensive fortifications to try to hinder it. So with all of those things together, plus the exhaustion of 2 years of war, you can see some justification for these headlines we're being seen lately, that the clock is ticking. And that's an interesting reversal, because we've seen that previously in this conflict said about Russia. But Russia is now settling down for the long war. It's mobilizing its economy. It's moving to a full war footing. It's continuing to throw vast amounts of money at recruiting people to throw them into the front line. And so it is coming down to a test of attrition. And those tests of attrition tend to favor Russia.
And if the media is a couple of weeks behind in reporting what's actually happening, what's the discrepancy? What is the reality, do you think, that's being missed?
It depends on which phase of the campaign we're looking at. There are usually developments on the ground, or the way the campaign is shaping on the ground, that takes a little while to feed through into the general coverage. It's only if you look at the people who are actually reporting directly from the front lines, for example, did you get a day-to-day update on what the situation is. To take the example we have at the moment, the descriptions of that Russian offensive towards Kharkiv are not at the moment generally reflecting the fact that this has been stalled, it has been prevented, and there is not any indication that Russia is actually making a move on the city itself. That, of course, is not necessarily Russia's objective. There's been a plausible suggestion that what Russia actually wanted to do was create some kind of buffer zone away from Russia's own border to try to respond to these cross-border attacks, these cross-border sustained raids that Ukraine had been mounting into Russia's Belgorod region. But either way, of course, it's enormously damaging for the Ukrainian defenders. They've been reportedly having to shift defending troops from other sectors of the front line to ensure that Russia doesn't make any further inroads. And this is in a situation where Ukraine's forces are already stretched thin.
This kind of thing often elicits nuclear threats by Russia. The latest comes from Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov after Belgium's pledge to send US-made F-16s to Kyiv. He said he hoped Belarusian drills on non-strategic nuclear weapons would knock some sense into our opponents. Do you think the West's cautious approach until now was ever justified?
There's always room for caution when you're dealing with the possibility that there might be a release of nuclear weapons. However, there's a weight of evidence that suggests the early assessments of Russia's nuclear intimidation program were in fact correct, that it is not important when Russia says something. You only need to pay attention when Russia does something. And the assessment that in fact this was not a realistic threat has been borne out by every single instance that we've seen since then, because it's a standard response by Russia. Something happens they don't like, they find some way of attempting to press the rhetorical nuclear button, not the actual one, in order to try to deter it. And of course, over time, the effect of that wears thin. Now, in this particular case, we've seen not just Sergei Lavrov, but also a range of the usual suspects from the Russian Foreign Ministry and their spokesman doing precisely what they've explained their job is, trying to ramp up the fear of some kind of nuclear use by Russia. And that has been extremely effective, of course, in constraining specifically the United States and to some extent Germany as well, because it builds on a much longer program of laying the groundwork for this campaign of intimidation. When we studied the way in which Russia's messengers and its mouthpieces had actually been pushing these messages about Russia being on a nuclear hair trigger, we saw it going back a decade plus with this very consistent program of trying to get Western thinkers about escalation to equate that with Russian nuclear use. And the result of that has been that instead of talking about escalation management, it's now escalation avoidance, because people think that you cannot compete in any form of escalation with Russia because that will inevitably lead to nuclear use. That's a massive strategic success for Russia because it's completely changed the terms of the debate about deterrence.
It's interesting that you talk about this campaign of intimidation, and people like yourself and many other people over and over again highlight that. It's extraordinary that it still works.
It is absolutely bizarre. And of course, it is extremely well documented. People in this industry have studied very closely how Russia's nuclear doctrine has evolved. It's gone through multiple phases since the end of the Cold War, and we more or less know precisely where we are. In March of last year, there was a Chatham House report called specifically Russian Nuclear Intimidation, how Russia shapes Western behaviors, which examined all of this and broke down both the causes and the effect. It is, as you say, it is extraordinary that we know how this works, and yet we see it continue to work on those Western politicians that are willing to buy into this fiction.
And what is your assessment of how you combat that?
It is extremely hard to know how exactly that can be combated, because, as always, talking about the West as a whole is a little bit misleading, because there are different countries with different attitudes, of course, across that coalition of countries that are backing Ukraine. But I think it's very indicative that the countries that are most vocal about disregarding Russia's nuclear flouncing are precisely the ones that have the most to lose if they're wrong. It is the frontline states again. It's the Baltic states, Poland, Finland, all of whom point out very clearly that there is no rationale for paying attention to what Russia says as opposed to what Russia actually may be considering doing. Now, they would be in the front line of any catastrophic consequences from Russian nuclear use, and yet they are the most vocal in pointing out indirectly that the United States is wrong to have bought into this Russian narrative.
And if we just return to the ground war now in Ukraine, in what state do you judge the Russian military at this point? And is there any significance in them redeploying the Africa core units to Ukraine, do you think?
One of the most striking things about the current situation is the consensus that you get from military analysts, from people who are long-term watchers of the Russian military, and also from chiefs of defense and defense intelligence heads and defense ministers across Europe, all saying more or less the same thing about their assessment of where the Russian military is. First of all, that it is a different army from the one that went into Ukraine in 2022. That one was eviscerated and it's been rebuilt in a different image, but that it is now larger. And while they are burning through rapidly their post-Soviet stocks of armored vehicles, of artillery, and so on, which is outstripping their ability to actually make new ones, it's still the case that they have reserves to draw on. And people are estimating 2025 as being the time when finally Russia's stocks start to run out. In the meantime, of course, Russia has a military implement which is designed for a different kind of war, but it's the kind of war that Russia is entirely comfortable fighting, a war of attrition, a war where you don't count your own casualties, a war where bodies are good for soaking up Ukrainian bullets until there are none left.
Yeah, and on that point, how long do you think they can keep up this tempo without a massive mobilization?
Well, again, the assessments from all the people who watch these things closely do seem to concur that Russia at the moment is not having any difficulty in bringing recruits into its armed forces, partly by throwing vast amounts of money at the problem. Vast, life-changing amounts of money, which are for people in rural, provincial Russia, usually very poor areas, are actually really a genuine incentive to go and sign up. Plus, of course, Russia is bringing in manpower from other countries as well. We've seen Nepalese, we've seen Cubans, we've seen citizens of a number of other countries who have ended up in Ukraine fighting for Russia, whether or not they actually intended to be there in the first place. Now, of course, it's a big question just how useful they're going to be to the Russian war effort, because if they don't speak Russian, they're not going to be very good at following instructions. But again, if Russia just wants the so-called meat waves, if it wants ways of soaking up Ukrainian resilience and Ukrainian bullets, then they'll do the job.
There have been reports by Russian mill bloggers that a Russian army general, commander of the Russian 20th Combined Arms Army, has been sacked. This hasn't been independently verified, but the Institute for the Study of War said this would be significant as it's the first dismissal of an officer actively commanding Russian forces. What do you think President Putin's ambition is in general with the recent reappointments and sackings that you've seen?
Yes, there's definitely something going on in terms of turnover of individuals in responsible positions in the Russian Ministry of Defense and in the armed forces. And again, the consensus seems to be that now that Russia is taking this war seriously and realizing that it is going to go on for some considerable time, Russia wants to be in a position to ensure that it can withstand that. Now, I mentioned a moment ago the enormous amounts of money Russia is spending. We've seen also this week Russia raising its tax rates for the first time in a considerable period, including corporation tax, trying to bring in more funds to keep it going. But of course, the other side of that is making sure that if they do arrive in the defense ministry, they're spent in a sensible manner and not don't disappear into the sand through corruption to quite the same extent they have in the past. So that may lie behind some of the reshuffles that we've seen in the defense ministry, trying to make the corruption a little bit more efficient, perhaps. And in terms of the retribution for speaking out against the conduct of the war, we've seen some criminal prosecutions of senior officers, which may be linked to that. But again, it's an ongoing process. And whenever this happens within the Russian system, you always think of that Churchill comment that the Kremlin infighting is like the bulldogs fighting under a rug. You don't know who's going to come out on top until the bones fly out.
And what have you learned about President Putin since February 2022? Do you feel your understanding of him has changed at all?
Sadly, no. And unfortunately, that's because there were people who understood perfectly well what the threat from Putin was before February 2022. But for too long, their warnings went unheeded. And again, you have to look to the frontline states, those most directly in the path of Russian intervention, for that greater understanding of precisely what was at stake. But as the representatives of the Baltic states and of Poland say now, after they've heard from so many other European leaders, we should have listened to you. Their plea is, well, can you listen to us now? There's no shortage of understanding of exactly what kind of threat Russia poses, and with Putin at the head of it or without him. But the only problem is actually getting that understanding across to the people who can take decisions about confronting that threat.
And from your understanding, how and where is Putin looking for opportunities to disrupt and disturb outside Ukraine? Can you describe the different layers of influence used by the Kremlin?
Well, here too, it's been a recent spike of reporting across Western media, which actually reflects a very long-standing problem, a long-standing trend. There has been this wave of reports about so-called hybrid warfare, about sabotage, about attacks that have been carried out across Europe. The GPS jamming, which has been going on for a decade, has suddenly hit the headlines as well. In part, of course, that is a reflection of the fact that there's been a coincidence, a number of different cases of investigations reported at the same time, but it uncovers a much longer standing problem. Russia has been at war with Europe in every domain except open military conflict, again, since the period shortly after the seizure of Crimea in 2014. And how prominent that is in Western media and in the thinking of Western politicians tends to be a function of how much attention it's getting at any given time rather than the actual intensity of attacks. So there's no doubt that Russia is now more visible in terms of the attacks it's carrying out. What we can't tell is whether that is a result of the Western victims, the countries in which these attacks are being carried out, being more effective or more interested in investigating and prosecuting them, whether it's just more publicity because the cases are coming to court, or whether there's a genuine increase in tempo now that Russia has successfully managed to recruit so many proxies to carry out attacks that previously its own military intelligence officers would have done. Either way, it's illustrative of the problem that Europe faces, that if Russia does decide to go to war with another European state, it has means of immobilizing the continent by carrying out these attacks on a much greater scale than we've seen to date.
If we just return to Jens Stoltenberg, another point he was making as he prepares for this meeting of foreign ministers, he said that Ukraine can win this war, but only if allies give continued robust support. Why, when the general consensus is that the rights and wrongs of this war are so clear, that the resolve of Ukraine's allies can be so unclear?
The problem is that among Ukraine's supporters, you have countries that have the will but not the means, and the means but not the will. You've got countries that have thrown vast amounts of their own defense capacity into supporting Ukraine because that defense capacity, those weapon systems, those aircraft, those artillery pieces, armored vehicles, are doing the job that they were bought for, i.e., destroying Russian armor before it comes close to their own country. And that's a recognition of just how important this is. But of course, the scale is much smaller than those major players like the United States and Germany, who have the means, but not necessarily the will, who have poured large amounts of aid into Ukraine, but with one foot on the brake. The biggest individual contributors, but with these restrictions that we talked about earlier. And of course, the painful process of overcoming the reluctance, particularly in the United States, to deliver weapon systems that Ukraine identifies as being essential at any given moment in the campaign. So if only there were more countries with both the will and the capacity to do something about it, Ukraine would be in a much stronger place, and it would have that robust long-term aid that has been identified, both robust, not subject to interruptions like what we saw in the United States over the past few months, and also long-term, actually anchoring Ukraine into a system of defense support so that Russia understands that over the long term, it is not going to be able to outweight and outlast the West.
A couple of things we've talked about during this conversation were activities that Russia has been up to for a long time, but which haven't necessarily been talked about or had the prominence that they should have had. Is there something you'd like to highlight that we're missing at the moment that actually should be talked about right now and is not being listened to enough?
Western political leaders west of Warsaw, as usual, have been spectacularly bad at explaining to their electorates just what is at stake and how this is a long-term problem and it's going to be an expensive one. And people's lives are going to have to change as a result of the threat from Russia. Again, we talked about the consensus among analysts and among government officials about what Russia is actually planning. And it's extraordinary. Here, too, we've never seen such an agreement across the board on the fact that Putin is not intending to stop at Ukraine, and Russia is looking at the next target beyond Ukraine. That means that European security is under threat, and it means it needs to be defended. But so few countries have actually recognized what is required to make that happen. And we have countries like the UK that is still tinkering with percentages on its defense budget as opposed to recognizing the scale of the threat, the scale of the challenge, and just how profoundly this is going to change our lives.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been great talking to you on Frontline. Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.